Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing my Sisyphean task to do a review for every Magok in the game of War Thunder. Now, for the viewers that may be newer to the channel, you may not realize this, but I do have a playlist of videos that do nothing but review all of the Magoks for the Israeli tech tree in the game of War Thunder, and it goes very in depth into the differences between all of the various models of tanks that otherwise look very similar. And you may not realize this, but there are actually a lot of Magoks in the game. If we were to include the Sabra as well as all of the premium vehicles and the squadron vehicle, you go up to a total of 17 vehicles. So yes, I have spaded and do currently own every last one of these. While the Sabra isn't technically a Magok, it is basically part of the same family of vehicles, so I'm going to lump it in and add this video to that playlist once we're done. Now, in real life, the Sabra is not exactly a unique proposition. A lot of countries have older tanks, especially models like T-55s and M60s that they want to upgrade up to a higher quality so that they will at least be competitive on the modern battlefield. While the Israelis have undertaken several projects with their Magoks, the M60 and M48 series, the Sabra was one of the last ones that featured an upgrade to a whopping 120mm gun, whereas all of the previous versions featured either 90 or 105s. Also, before we get started, I've actually had a few individuals comment and ask me how I got the decals on my Israeli tanks. If you want to do the white barrel banding, you can simply take the 0 and mirror it and position it so that all you see is one half and the other. It actually makes for a pretty effective decal. Additionally, if you go under just generic allied tanks, there will be a triangle, and you simply position it on the vehicle so you're cutting off one side, and ta-da, you have the standard Israeli chevron and barrel band markings. Of course, kicking things off like we always do with the mobility, and the Sabra prominently features a 908 horsepower engine, which is an upgrade over the base engine on M60s and does give it at least a little bit more power to weight. However, the Sabra specifically does weigh 55 tons, so it's not exactly a light vehicle even under the best of times. Additionally, you only have a top speed of 48 kph forward and about 11 in reverse, so it definitely feels a little sluggish, not just to accelerate, but also when it gets all the way up to speed, especially compared to contemporary tanks. And if you get into a max up tier with things like Abrams and Leopard 2s, it will feel particularly sluggish. If you stick to things like roads and relatively soft ground, the Sabra will feel at least reasonably competitive with most of the other tanks in the matchup. However, as soon as you get on soft ground or inclines, you're going to notice the vehicle really struggles because its power to weight just really isn't up to scratch. Of course, continuing in the vein of the poor power to weight ratio, you will also find the vehicle can struggle to maneuver efficiently if you're at close quarters and you need to swing the tank around very quickly. It's not exactly the best in this area. It's not terrible, it's not unusual by any stretch of the imagination, but mobility is definitely one of the weaker aspects of this vehicle at 9.7. The armor of the Sabra is where the vehicle starts to get somewhat interesting. It's not good by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not anywhere near as bad as you might initially think, considering it is just an upgraded M60. It does add the side skirts, so it does at least add a minor amount of additional protection against things like auto cannons. However, it's not exactly reliable. The big thing is the upper front plate and the turret get some really effective armor, and I say really effective because all things are relative. These are M60s, you can't really expect them to stand up to most of the shells they fight at this battle rating. However, the upper front plate is around 200 to 300 millimeters of protection, and the turret face can frequently offer anywhere from 300 to 400 millimeters of protection, so the vehicle is actually pretty resilient to quite a few of the shells around this battle rating, especially heat rounds. On top of that, the mantlet, which is a common place that people like to shoot on these types of vehicles, is actually reasonably bouncy and will eat shells reasonably often. On top of that, its turret ring isn't very big and also isn't that weak either, so against auto cannons it does stand up better than you might be expecting for a late model M60. The vehicle also lacks a firewall separating the engine from the crew compartment, so this means that while in a normal tank, if you get hit in the back by a Sabo, the Sabo will pass through the firewall and generate secondary fragmentation. On the Sabra, it tends to just have most of the fragmentation eaten by the engine if somebody hits you in the back of the hull. This combination of features can actually make the Sabra reasonably durable in some scenarios. To top all of that off, I noticed the Sabra could frequently eat hits to the turret without suffering critical damage, and after reviewing the damage model, it's actually pretty obvious why. If you look at the ammo stowage, there is some stowage on the far left-hand side of the turret next to the loader, but on the whole, the turret is generally free of ammo, so if you're only poking your turret out over a ridgeline, enemies are unlikely to hit that ammo, especially because most enemies enemies have learned at this point that the M60's commander and gunner, the people you want to disable so it can't shoot back, are on the left hand side of the turret, so most enemies will not shoot for the right hand side of the turret with the loader and the ammunition. Additionally, because that's also the first stage ammo rack and will get depleted first, if you have been in some pretty intense fights and been firing off a lot of shells, there might not even be any ammo in there to detonate. So on the whole, I would characterize the durability of the Sabra as probably noticeably better than the average player would expect. It's not great and it's not reliable by any stretch of the imagination, but it did eat quite a few shells and it would often take more than one hit for enemies to kill me, so in that respect I do view the tank as actually pretty decently well armored. Of course, if you've seen my Mk1 grind series, you would also know that a lot of the Israeli Mk1s tend to have a 60mm mortar that functions as a smoke grenade launcher that you don't have to research the smoke grenade upgrade in order to actually use. This tank doesn't have that, and that's actually kind of annoying, especially if you've ground your way through most of the tech tree, because a lot of the later Mk1s do have it. This tank does have smoke grenade launchers. It has 2 banks of 6 each, and they are pretty good, but you do have to research it first, so you could get thrown off a little if you are going through the tech tree and going through a lot of the other Mk1s. Of course, moving on to the big feature that separates this Mk1 from all of its contemporaries, the Sabra actually features the 120mm gun. The gun is fully stabilized and also features a laser rangefinder and Gen 1 thermals. It doesn't have any thermals in the commander side, although this is to be expected for 9.7. The Sabra also helpfully features a laser warning receiver, which can be helpful to know if enemies are lasing you at long range or to know if you have a missile incoming from some kind of aircraft, so that is a nice feature to have, although it doesn't always come up. The Sabra's stock Heat FS shell pins about 480mm. This isn't bad for a Heat FS shell, it's perfectly serviceable, but obviously Heat FS shells do have a lot of weaknesses compared to APFSDS rounds, so you're going to want to get at something else right away, and fortunately the APFSDS round is only a rank 2 modification, so it's not exactly an arduous grind to get to it. The APFSDS shell, M322, will be very familiar to anybody who's seen the Mk1 grind series I have on this channel, because it is functionally identical to the same shell that is used on both the Mk1 3s and Mk1 4s. It's a high penning Sabo, pens almost 600mm of armor at point blank range, which is incredibly effective. It has a good muzzle velocity and generally has good damage. It's a fantastic shell for 9.7. While there are some enemies that you will have to aim for specific weak points those are few and far between, and the vast majority of opponents you can simply click on the middle and the shell will enter the crew compartment and quite often do fatal damage. This isn't quite a lull pen round, but it is pretty close. Of course, the Sabra does have one extra shell type, and this is the funny shell, the M339. Now, the M339 shell is supposed to be a variable fuse shell that you could either use to airburst over enemy positions or even fire it into fortified positions and have it detonate inside of a bunker or something. In game, these kind of bunker busting shells are usually represented as semi-armor piercing or sappy rounds. However, in this particular instance, they have chosen to represent it as a normal high explosive round, which creates some very weird eccentricities with this particular shell. As I've talked about in previous videos, you can basically shoot some of the middle road wheels on a tank and kill any tank in the game. And I did some looking into this to see exactly how this compared to some other shells, and I noticed that basically the exact same behavior could be observed on large caliber high explosive shells. On screen, this is the M107 shell compared directly to M339, and M107 is the standard 155 artillery shell that has a whopping 9.14 kilograms of TNT equivalent versus the M339's 3.66, so it has 3 times the explosive filler. And you'll notice in terms of maximum penetration, M107 has 61mm, whereas M339 has 65mm. So M339 in many instances will perform very similarly to a giant high explosive shell that has about 3 times the TNT equivalent, which is fairly ridiculous. Although you will notice with M107 that it keeps the same penetration regardless of angle and distance, whereas M339 doesn't. It actually behaves more like a normal armor piercing round, so I suppose this is the normal bunker busting that they're trying to represent, but it does make for a very unusual shell that can often get some really weird kills by hitting cupolas or road wheels, and especially on lightly armored vehicles, the shell is essentially a death sentence. You will annihilate them with basically no issues. Because of how insanely powerful M339 is, I wouldn't really recommend bothering with the Heat FS shell once you've actually researched and unlocked the APFSDS round, because the APFSDS round will deal with heavily armored targets and M339 will deal with everything else. including heavily armored targets if you know where to aim. Now, as far as the gun itself, there are actually two different reloads for the Israeli 120s. The Mk1 4s actually go all the way down to a 5-second reload, whereas the 3s go down to a 6-second reload. The Sabra actually uses the Mk1 3s, so if you have a fully aced crew, it'll have a 6-second reload, but you can still get your reload under that of most contemporary tanks pretty easily just by having a good crew or even an experted crew if you want to spend the silver. What this basically translates to is that you essentially have a lull pen gun that will go in one side and out the other of the majority of enemies you fight, also has an insanely powerful high explosive round, and also has a reload that is faster than the majority of enemies you fight. Fair to say this is probably the best 9.7 gun in the entire game. Now, as a bit of a side note, while a lot of the Magoks do have 50 cals, either roof mounted 50 cals or over barrel 50 cals, the Sabra does not have either. It does have two roof mounted machine guns, but they're just regular rifle caliber machine guns. This isn't a big deal, but it is a minor annoyance going up against things like lighter vehicles that the 50 cal can potentially shred and save you from having to take a main gun shot off or even be able to finish the enemy off before they can return fire. Now, getting into some closing thoughts, a lot of people that have frequently viewed this channel would know that I'm not really a fan of these later model M60s and feel like a lot of them are at battle ratings that they can't really sustain. But here's the Count of Monte Cristo twist in this little tale, in that I actually ended up really liking the Sabra. I didn't really go into my games with the Sabra thinking it was going to be terrible, but I did go in with a general mentality that it might be a bit of a rough ride. However, what really sold me on the vehicle was the combination of the armor and firepower. It wasn't just that it had a good gun, but that it could frequently absorb hits. If I were directly compare it to the most similar tank in the game, it would be the 120S in the American tree, and the main difference between the two tanks really is their battle rating. While the Sabra is only a little bit more mobile than the 120S, the 120S is at 10.3, so the 120S can fight some incredibly mobile tanks like Abrams, Leopards, or even the Type 90, whereas the Sabra doesn't really see those enemies all that often. Even something like an Abrams or a Leo 2 are basically only in a max up tier. On top of the fact that while the 120S does theoretically have better turret cheek armor, it also has a much bigger turret ring and also fights significantly more powerful guns on average, so the Sabra's modest armor is actually more effective for its battle rating. And to top it off, while the 120S has a crazy good gun, the Sabra only loses a little bit of reload and has a much more powerful high explosive shell to match, so the Sabra's gun for its battle rating again is generally more effective, especially as the 120S fights an increasing staple of tanks that you can't actually just click on the middle of, so you actually have to aim for weak points on them while they don't have to aim for weak points on you. To top it off, the Abrams breach is fairly weak, and a lot of enemies have learned to simply aim for it, and you'll mostly disable the tanks or kill the crew just by hitting the breach, whereas the Sabra seems a lot more resilient in this area, or at least anecdotally I noticed it was better at taking those hits. If anything, my playtime with the Sabra has really cemented for me my original assessment that the 120S was significantly over-tiered in terms of its battle rating. The developers really should have just given it basic M829 and not bothered with the A1 or A2 shells and just dropped it down to 9.7, because there are very few instances where the 120S can really live up to the potential of being an M1A1 at 10.3. So ultimately, while I ended up basically hating the 120S, I actually ended up really liking the Sabra because, spoiler, the Sabra is actually at a battle rating where it feels like it does have some meaningful advantages over the enemy it fights, even though it doesn't feel overpowered by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a generally good tank that has features that you can use to your advantage. On top of that, if you want a backup for your Mk1 3s, the Sabra does have exactly the same gun, so the Sabra can at least do some work in that aspect as well, all the way up to top tier. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the Sabra, but what about you? Do you think it's great? Do you think it's terrible? Are you indifferent? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, don't give it a shoes.